Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox and Watchbox Studios. Thanks for logging on. This is Watches Tonight. This evening, we discuss the greatest scandal in watchmaking history. Separately, discuss watches that were not ready for prime time, chat live, and I share your wrist shots. All that tonight on Watches Tonight. Remember to check out the redesigned homepage of thewatchbox.com. There is so much there, and it changes every single day, sometimes several times a day. Every watch, every brand, every era. Check it out. The best way to window shop while you watch. But open another window and keep me streaming. Okay, while we file into the show, I was struck that August is a big month for collector cars in the United States. Pebble Beach, the Quail, the Monterey Historics, all of them top of the line, the best cars and the highest level of preparation, all of that. And yet, despite our huge high-end classic car scene here in the United States, we still have countless dealers advertising well-kept vintage cars as concours condition. Best in Show, Pebble Beach this year. Here's the problem. Quick note to these sellers. Concours d'Elegance is where your four-wheeled, well, nope, I think that's not us right there. We're preempting a little bit. But Concours d'Elegance is where your four-wheeled relics worth seven figures vie for prize money. One more time, folks. Concours, now we can bring that back, is the place where you select the topping for your Auntie Annie's pretzel, while Paul Blart, mall cop, scopes out for shoplifters. Now we know the difference. Concours and Concours. Please don't confuse them. Checking out our box. And our chatters in the box. It's the chat box. Alex O, Blue Shirt Buddha, Edward Ledden of Sweden, Burning Mr. B, Daniel Waxman. We've got Marco B, Mr. No Date, Marcus T, Blue Shirt Buddha, Dan CT, Wachusius joining in from Dubai, Arto Charles. We've got Dave Opencar, Kevin H, Bob Golub from Paris, France, staying up late with us, Scott Wexlin, Hale Bob, Adam Crossfire, Randy Reeves, Joe Tyson from Apex, North Carolina, Jim Millett, and Mikhail Z, all longtime viewers, friends, and supporters of the show. Thanks for joining in. We got Sean on the switcher. He's the man who makes the magic happen. So, let's take a quick look. Yours on mine. Viewer wrist shots number one. Kevin L. hits the road with his Audi and a Lange und Söhne Odysseus Datamatic. One of the cooler sports watches you'll see. Note, this one is the white gold version. Kunal M and his baby daughter share appreciation for the Patek Philippe Calatrava 5196J. Simon T posts watches and whiskers with his VC Overseas self-winding and Corgi. Note the Back to the Future 2 Doc Brown goggles. Conrad impresses with the Acura NSX Supercar, the latest generation, and the Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter in two-tone. And then there is, well, me on Dutch TV, illustrating the Rolex Day-Date, owned apparently by Holland's King, and Joost B caught that and sent me the shot of Dutch television pilfering the photo of my watch. But I'll say this, I'm glad they used it. That's fair use. That's all good. I like the fact that it's there. It would be nice to get credit, but apparently my wrist is such a celebrity, you guys note it all the same. Send your wrist shots to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com to see your pieces on these pixels. Let's see who's joining in right here. We've got Young XL from Atlantic, Canada. We've got Martin Hansen from Denmark. Butik One joining us from Poland. Addie Myers from the UK. Terry C. Hello, Tim and Watchbox crew. We've got Alexi from Finland. We've got Jabo Surf from Adelaide, Australia, a Mick in Florida, and Tariq Chaudhry checking in from Greenport, Long Island, very close to my old haunt in Suffolk County. All right, the Jaquet Affair. This was by far, and it wasn't close, and I'm talking miles, the single biggest scandal in the history of watchmaking. No YouTuber, no vintage dealer, no John Mayer lawsuit, nothing compares to the Jaquet Affair, because it involves two of the biggest names in watchmaking, Rolex and Counterfeit. Now, let's talk about unscrupulous dealers, counterfeiters, black market watches, and even armed robbers who target watches. We've discussed them all, but almost without exception, these are industry outsiders. They are rogues. They have tenuous links to the watch community and comparatively small-scale operations. They're fly-by-night outfits with no name to lose, little to lose overall, in fact. In the early 2000s, Jean-Pierre Jaquet was anything but a small-timer. Jaquet had been a fixture in the Swiss watch industry as a dealer, a vintage specialist, a machinist, and a parts supplier since the early 1980s. He was, for the most part, a dealer, a hustler, and occasionally a machinist for bigger names in the industry. He had sales experience, and blending fabrication and sales was not unusual in the Swiss watch industry then or now, for that matter. What was unusual was his reputation. So in spite of these connections and good standing with major brands, he had a record of theft, counterfeiting, and jail time prior to founding his company, Jaquet SA, in the 1990s. He established that factory in the 1990s and became one of the original three principals with Eric Loth and Ernst Tomke in a company called the British Masters, which owned, among others, Graham, Arnold & Son, and Tompion watches. So that was a pretty big partnership at the time, and the brands were all reliable customers of his factory, Jaquet. Jaquet was something of a value specialist. They would take unfinished abauches, which were still readily available in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they would finish them for customers. They would also build value-based movements and complications. A bit of a jack-of-all-trades, white-label watch movement factory. It had no brand of its own, but it had many well-known name-brand customers. And despite his criminal record, Jaquet was well-connected and enjoyed a full order book. Among his partners, or we may as well just call them clients, but they were invested in as much as he supplied their parts, Gerard Perregaux, the earliest iterations of F.P. Journe, several Richemont companies, Maurice Lacroix, Graham, Tompion, Arnold, and reportedly many others. Jaquet was a big deal in the watchmaking capital of Switzerland, La Chaux de Fonds. Everyone knew him, but few liked him. For a man who was a major kingpin of the industry, unlike, say, Michel Parmigiani, Jaquet engendered no affection, maybe grudging admiration, but he was not a warm and cuddly character. He was aggressive, ambitious, greedy, overbearing, and brusque. Nevertheless, he was also successful and powerful, and all of that began unraveling in 2002. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I'm going to jump into my chat box where I've got Dr. TikTok from Florida. I've got Edward Ledden asking, did he finance it with drug money? It gets even better than that. If it were just drug money, we probably wouldn't be talking. This is going to be fun. Right here, we got Mark S. from Brooklyn joining us for our high-stakes drama. We've got Hans N. We've got Eric Nielsen. We've got Thomas Burnett, William Rizzo, and we've got Adam Crossfire, Stephen Schweizer, and lots of good friends. We've got Corentin C. from Paris joining us from continental Europe, staying up late with us, watching watches. We've got Leroy joining us from Zimbabwe. Leroy, thank you so much for joining us from Zimbabwe and staying up late with us. Chris Foster from the UK and Robert Dixon from Scotland, who is also a big BMW fan, as I recall. Taking a look at a few more viewer wrist shots right here. We've got from far-flung regions of the world, Mohammed E. of Nairobi, Kenya, rolling with his BMW and his Zenith Chronomaster Sport from Watchbox, Dubai. Thank you for trusting our company in Dubai. Adam C. of the UK, okay, it's not a wrist shot, but he's sharing an actual Le Mans raced vintage Bentley for Le Mans Week 2021. Take a look at that Jaquet speedometer tachometer hybrid. Also, and this is how you know you're talking pre-war Bentley, red line of 3,500 RPM. Oh, right there, Watchoosiest. Taking delivery of his 2021 Tudor Black Bay AG925 sterling silver taupe dial and bezel, one of the first of these I've seen in the wild. Congratulations, wear it in good health. Patrick B. is in Naples, Florida, with the current generation Breguet Marine, which I must say looks gorgeous on the wrist. Wolfgang K. of Austria shares his IWC Big Pilot's watch Mojave in a lovely warm sand camouflage. Guys, send your wrist shots to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com to see your analog on my digital. Let's see what's going on in the box. Matthew G. saying, Tim, I think it's time you did an audiobook. Well, this one's the first in our true crime series. What else is going on? We've got VDB DG joining in from Hong Kong, getting up early with us. And we've got Watchoosiest, who is responding in real time to his wrist shot. I love it, you guys. You are my most reliable supporters. Philip Lynn asking, Tim, what are your thoughts on the JLC Reverso Duo Face Tribute released in 2019? I would have to say that I like the 2019 model better than the 2017, and that's just down to personal taste. If you can wear the monstrous non-antième, get that. But you're going to need a big wrist, because that one's about, I want to say like 49.4 millimeters lug to lug, 29.9 across. That is the double-side reverso to own. If you can get your hands on it, you've got the wrist for it, and you've got the budget to float it. All right, Jaquet, the plot thickens. There he is again. Things are about to get real. Reporters Marcus Studler and Daniel Hug, writing for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in October of 2003, explained what happened next, and it was high drama. 2002 witnessed two extraordinary events, and the reporting from Studler and Hug really lays it all out. Starting with Miranda, a case finisher in Chaux de Fonds that was, at the time, doing business with Rolex, providing final finishing on Rolex gold cases. Well, Miranda was the subject in January of 2002 of a bold, broad daylight armed robbery, and it was gold Rolex watch cases that were targeted. Up to 1,000 of them were stolen at gunpoint, again, in broad daylight in a very safe town in the heartland of Swiss watchmaking, Chaux de Fonds. In June of that year, RSM, another component fabricator, this time in Le Loc, was robbed, once again armed, of 10 to 12 kilograms of solid gold. Remember last time we spoke about watch theft and why it's not safe to keep a safe with high value in your house. I said all the criminals need is access to you to extort the opening of the safe. Well, that's exactly what happened at RSM. People broke in and, at gunpoint, forced the personnel to open the safe and give them 12 kilograms of solid gold. It gets weirder. On October 3rd, well, let's zoom back a little bit, because this gets very wrapped around the axle before it gets clear. It starts with a 35-year-old Bosnian, a person of no standing in the watch industry, a person with no connection to any known manufacturer or brand. But he was arrested in 2002 with the gold, well, at the very least, in connection with the gold stolen from RSM. So here you have an industry outsider and career criminal nabbed for robbing over $300,000 in solid gold. And it should be mentioned that the Miranda robbery at the case factory was an inside job, and Jose Miranda, the owner of the factory, was caught and charged. On October 7th, 2003, the House of Cards imploded. That is when Swiss police raided the Jaquet SA factory in Chaux de Fonds, arrested Jaquet himself, and corralled almost a dozen co-conspirators. Now, the proximate cause was Jaquet's connection to these two armed robberies of high-value gold and gold components. But a scheme to produce bogus Rolex watches was revealed as evidence on the scene. In the factory, they found a sophisticated mass production setup for using a combination of real Rolex cases and stolen gold to make fake Rolex watches that were extremely persuasive because, in large part, they used Rolex parts. All of this, keep in mind, is at a major Swiss manufacturer, deeply embedded in the Swiss watch industry. Not a machine shop in coastal China, not something in South Africa or Italy, attempting to counterfeit Rolex watches with over 20 pounds of stolen gold and actual Rolex case parts pilfered at gunpoint. This was shocking to the Swiss watch industry at the time. It is a small world. As small as Switzerland is, the watch industry is even smaller. You could probably draw an 80-mile circle and encompass almost everything that is luxury watch production in Switzerland. And this shook that scene to the core. Europa Star magazine, writing in October of 2003, when the original bust was made, described the late-stage unraveling of the scheme as involving threats against Jaquet and his family that resulted in him carrying a gun. But at the time, It was known that threats were being made and that gunshots were being exchanged, but the failure to report the threats and even the violence heavily suggested he didn't want authorities to take a closer look, which is the exact opposite of what you would expect if people were testing your safety with firearms and threatening your family in their own homes. There were even shots fired into the business offices of the Jaquet factory. Why wasn't all of this reported and investigated? Well, it became obvious. Studler and Hug's reporting elaborates upon this drama that unfolded just prior to Jaquet's downfall. Allegedly, Jaquet's phone was initially tapped by Swiss authorities as early as 2002, which means they were on to his scheme, or at the very least understood that he was tangential or even accessory to the schemes. Remember, in January, that was the first armed robbery, and they picked up on Jaquet by the middle of 2002. It's important to note that as the authorities closed in, the co-conspirators turned on each other, and again, Studler and Hug really delve into the details. There was a drive-by shooting at the factory, threats against Jaquet's family, which is enough, one would imagine, to lead someone to report threats and violence. And apparently everyone involved in the scheme was simply turning on each other, trying to intimidate each other into not being the one who squealed to authorities. And that's what this all came down to. It was about trying to scare everyone else into silence. This was a big conspiracy. So now, writing in QP magazine, Alan Downing described the scene of the crime as police raided the Jaquet factory, including large amounts of unexpected Frank Muller watch parts, over $300,000 left in pure gold, and allegedly even persuasive accessory sets and documents relating to some of the counterfeit watches that were being made. That's right, not only were they counterfeiting watches, but they had authentic documents, accessory sets, boxes, papers, everything to make it look really real from inside the watch industry. Rumors of counterfeit Franck Muller, Swatch Group, and Richemont products swirled, and talk of a connection to the theft of a UN prototype watch was also thrown in, leading this to also be known as the Ulysse Affair, because a prototype watch was in fact stolen from Ulysse Nardin in Le Loc, and somehow Jaquet was tied even to that. This is a tangled web. Before we get any deeper in, it's important to note that Nicholas Hayek Sr. was widely quoted at the time summarizing the Jaquet affair as a shocking inside job, saying it's like a bunch of cardinals got together and robbed the Vatican Bank. And that's exactly what this was. Now, jumping into the box right here, let's see what you guys are saying. We have a question from Dr. TikTok. Patek new 6119R versus 5196. Is the price difference worth it? The 5196P is very special. If that's the one you've got in mind, I would say go with that. If not, I would say definitely consider the 6119. But remember, there's also the 5119, and there's the 3919 before that. There are a lot of -19 watches to consider, some of which are not going to cost you a lot of money. So consider your options. That is a model line that, with the 3919, dates all the way back to 1985. But I do love the 5196P, and I would say that's probably the best time-only watch Patek ever made. I'm just going to come out and say it. I love everything about that watch. What else is going on? We have Cassidy asking, hey Tim, do you know the difference between the Liditz Watch Technicum and the New York or the York Time Institute? Well, Liditz is associated with Rolex, so at the very least I can say if you want a Rolex certified education as a watchmaker and you want to actually make a watch before you leave watchmaking school, I would recommend Liditz. I don't know much about York Time. I would say this though, we have Liditz watchmakers downstairs and they're some of the best in the industry, so just based on my familiarity, I would say go with Liditz if you have the opportunity. You will get a fantastic education, and if nothing else, you'll walk away with a watch of your own fabrication, and not a counterfeit either. We have Loy P saying, unbelievable this Jaquet scandal. Somebody should pitch this story to Netflix. I don't know, maybe that'll be my Netflix feature after all. The tough thing about relating the Jaquet story is that it occurred in the early 2000s, and a lot of it was covered in local newspapers and magazines. And while the internet was well established in the United States back then, anyone who's been to Baselworld or SIHH in the last 10 years realizes that Swiss internet, even today, isn't what you would expect in the United States. So the idea that all these local newspapers and magazines and regional newspapers would upload everything they knew about Jaquet online from the early 2000s, it's highly unlikely. There is very little documentation of the scandal, especially if you want it in English. I had to do a ton of French translation to get you even this much that I've just related. The Jaquet scandal is hardly ever mentioned in the modern-day wristwatch press because for the most part today, we cover things that occurred in the modern era, and this is almost pre-internet from a watch perspective, as there was very little online watch community back in 2002 and 2003 when all of this was going down. A lot of the documentation was never posted up on the internet as the news was pre-internet by Swiss standards, and then a lot of it's in French, which makes it even tougher to cover this story. But a major watch industry insider counterfeiting Rolex watches, stealing gold and Rolex parts at gunpoint. I do think someone's got to do a comprehensive retrospective on this. I hope it's not just me and this video. We got Andy Man saying, Tim for Prez. Hey, if that's the case, I am much obliged. I don't think that'll ever happen, but who knows? It would be nice to be on the GPHG jury someday. That would be fantastic. I could retire happy. And then right here we got Martin Hansen asking, we all know the Holy Trinity. In your opinion, who are the third most important brands in watch history and why? I say, or who are the three most important brands in watch history and why? I say Rolex, Patek, and Seiko. I would say Breguet, like the original Breguet of Abraham Louis Breguet and his sons. That's pretty hard to discount. You might have to give it to just people who are no longer alive. Like if you want to talk about basic innovations in timekeeping, probably, Harrison, Breguet, and Ferdinand Berthoud. I mean, it's going to be guys who've been dead for 1,000,000 years. In the 20th century, yeah, I think you'd have to say Patek Philippe, Rolex, and Seiko. And then in the 21st century, honestly, for all their innovations in materials and design and engineering, I would say Ulysse Nardin, and they're not going to get a lot of credit in that regard. I would also say among independents, F.P. Journe, as much for the movement that he started among independents as the actual watches themselves. And then finally, it's difficult to say, but for the sheer scope of its accomplishment, I love the work that Lange has done and what they've achieved. So maybe not important from a technical standpoint, but in raising standards for the whole industry, it's hard to ignore what they've done with mass-produced watches. What else is going on? John Prosser asking, Tim, when are you coming to the UK? Guys, I would love to come to the UK. That would be an absolute ball. Probably when the latest COVID flare-up dies down. We're going to have to wait for that, but I'll probably be in Dubai this fall. So if you're going to be in Dubai for Dubai Watch Week, check out the Watchbox booth. I'll be there. What else is going on? We have Karate Chop saying, Debatoon, say Debatoon. I love them. I love them. But if you want to talk about the brand that created the current craze for independence, frankly, it's probably F.P. Journe. Now, if you want to talk about technical innovation, I am more impressed by Debatoon, and I like their watches better. So that's what I'd buy with my own money for my own wrist. Okay, we have questions from Philip Lynn. What are your thoughts on the quality and design of the Type 21 by Breguet, the 3817? You have to have two separate sets of expectations with Breguet. On the one hand, you've got the Type 20, 21, and 22. On the other hand, you've got everything else. They really are the Type 20 series, and that's the 21 and the 22 included. They're made more in a utilitarian fashion. While the watches are attractive and nicely executed, they are more like Omegas in terms of their mechanics and finish, whereas the other watches, including the revived and revised Marine collection post-2018, those are much more haute horlogerie timepieces. Those are watches that are far more finely finished and comparable to, your Pateks, your Vacherons, distantly, I'd say also Lange. Breguet has two different sets of finish, and the Pilot's watches are on a lower echelon, partly to make them cheaper, partly to enable high volume. That's why really the only base metal you see in large volume from Breguet, I know they're the Marines, but their high volume steel and titanium is really going to be the Pilot's watches. And then we've got Nefarion saying Debatoon is just too weird and too niche, unless you count the DB25s. Those are a lot more conventional. And then right here, We have Jean-Claude Beaver joining in. We have a question from Loy P. asking, what do you think of Bulgari? They're innovating consistently, and I think they deserve to be taken much more seriously. When will the watch fam start warming up to the brand? Well, they've got to be careful about their variants. I think as much as I love the watches they've released since 2014 with the Octo Finissimo series, there are a lot of variants, and they feel a little bit like some of the other LVMH watch group brands in that regard. Hublot, Tag Heuer, and Zenith are run separately within LVMH from Bulgari, which governs itself. But if you make too many special editions, regional editions, new editions, dial colors, cases, bracelets, straps, all of that dilutes the basic appeal of the watch. If there's one lesson we can take from Rolex, it's that you should only make a few watches and a few variants, do it consistently, and keep supply scarce relative to demand. And I think that's what Bulgari really needs to do. And if it does that well over time, then we'll see stronger resale values, we'll see maybe short wait lists. I don't want to see long wait lists, but maybe short ones. And you'll see greater collector esteem for probably just the Octo Finissimos, because they've got a lot of other watches like the Octos that are not Finissimo and the Romas that, you know, people don't really love. And I think it's important to bolster esteem for those sub-brands within Bulgari just as much as it is to build up the Octo Finissimo. And then within Octo Finissimo, just fewer variants overall. And make sure you sell them at retail. Don't allow discounted watches to get into the market. I know there's going to be a lot of temptation to discount sometimes, especially in some areas where a combination of COVID and political unrest haven't allowed the markets to recover. And I'm talking to you, Hong Kong. So you want to make sure that Bulgari is a good steward of its brand, because the watches themselves are incredible products. See what else you guys are saying in the box right here. We have JMB, we've got Turbo T2 saying, for pure innovation, what about Max and MB&F? Max and MB&F are great. I think the watches are an interesting continuation of kind of the spirit of the Harry Winston Opus series. Bring in collaborators from the industry, name them all, give credit where credit's due, and market the watch as a collaboration. That's important, and I think it's important because it has raised the esteem for independent watchmaking, but I don't necessarily think that there's been a huge amount of innovation. I think for the most part, MB&F watches tend to be styling exercises, and a lot of them are powered by Sellita or Girard-Perregaux movements, and they do have some in-house calibers that are very impressively made, but they're not for the most part incredibly advanced. I would say the one place where they really stepped beyond the norm was with the Legacy Machine Perpetual. That was, I believe, with Stephen McDonnell, a very sophisticated take on the Perpetual calendar that was unlike other Perpetuals done before, but for the most part, they're automatics, they're jump hours, they're tourbillon watches. Even when the tourbillon is in-house, they're not terribly innovative in the sense that they're doing anything that hasn't been done before. Most of the design is by Eric Giroux. He's a fantastic designer. I love his work. Through the Looking Glass is his company. You'll see him credited on almost all of the major MB&F watches. I just don't see anything there that is so breakthrough. It shatters our expectations for MB&F or the industry as a whole. I feel like every MB&F watch builds incrementally on the MB&F that came before it. So great watches, just not hugely revolutionary. The Harry Winston Opus series, especially starting with the Opus 3, that was Max's real revolution. MB&F after that has been an evolution. Now, jumping back into viewer wrist shots number 3. Connor P. spotlights a rarely seen Admiral's Cup Seafender Tides 48 in titanium. Christian L. has a taste for fine wine and digital displays with his Casio G-Shock Gold. Love the lume. We've got Eamon M. of Dublin, Ireland, and in Dublin, Ireland, he shares his ride and wrist with Seiko SSA 385 and BMW 3 Series. We've got Tobias L. of Phuket, Thailand, cruising with his rose gold Rolex Cellini Dual Time, a rare Cellini spotting on the channel, and Elton H. of County Carlow, Ireland, draws our attention with the Siderius watch brand. He wants you to check them out. Also showing some fine ink, nicely cuffed. Send your wrist shots to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com. Okay, the Jaquet Affair and its aftermath. So, Radio Television Suisse took account of the fallout on September 1st, 2008, which was when the final verdicts were handed down in the Jaquet Affair. 34 total people indicted. Jacquet himself was sentenced to 4.5 years, plus he was ordered to pay restitution of 750,000 Swiss francs. He served 14 months, serving his post-arrest time, so it was 4.5 years plus 14 months starting in 2003 when he was first taken in. And yet, doesn't that sound awfully, I don't know, lenient? This is a guy who minimally should have been rung up for accessory to armed robbery, possession of high-value stolen goods, witness tampering and intimidation, lying to authorities, counterfeiting and intellectual property violations of Rolex, no less, in a country where both of those are huge offenses, and just 4.5 years. In fact, in 2010, he was briefly released while he appealed his sentences before going back to jail to serve out his last 16 months. I feel like that was, again, awfully lenient, which leads me to wonder, did he just know too much? Because they had these people dead to rights. They had the goods. They had co-conspirators willing to dish on each other and turn state's witness. They had a huge amount of physical evidence and testimony. But 4.5 years? For all the stuff Jaquet was connected to, I would not have been surprised if he received a sentence of 10 times that. And it makes me wonder, as with Lance Armstrong when he was sued by the government for allegedly defrauding his sponsor, the Postal Service, did Jaquet just know so much that authorities didn't want to pry any deeper? Like with Armstrong, there was this tiny settlement in the end, and it was almost nothing. It was a few $1,000,000. The case was supposed to be a $100 million case against Armstrong, and in the end, it was settled with a whimper and hardly any money relative to the damages that could have been changing hands. And I just wonder if Jaquet, as connected as he was to the industry and as deep as he was in counterfeiting, did he just know something that authorities didn't want him to share? Cut a deal and get off relatively scot-free, because by some accounts, he's still working in the watch industry. At some point, wouldn't you just not give your money to some people? But again, why he received such a lenient sentence is the last great unsolved mystery of this epic saga. What else happened? Well, in 2005, Jaquet SA, having been divested of Jaquet's personal interests in the company, became La Jacquet, a movement manufacturer in La Chaux de Fonds, in the old Jaquet factory. New name, same friendly folks. 2010, Arnold & Son was brought back as the house brand of La Jacquet. 2012, Citizen Watch bought both Arnold and La Jacquet, making it their high-end Swiss arm, basically haute horlogerie with Japanese bankrolling. And in 2015, they relaunched Angelus as a sort of apex brand for the entire Citizen Watch empire. Guys, if you know something about Jaquet I don't, let me know in the chat box or the description below this video. How was it he got off with such a small sentence and so little time served? And frankly, such a small fine? I just don't know. Viewer wrist shots number 4. Jeb B is in Corfu with his Omega Seamaster Aquaterra World Timer. Artosi of New York City, actually, is keeping good company with his Tudor Black Bay GMT while watching Watches Tonight. Andrew S of the UK captures his Autodromo Group B at the Robert Looms showroom. We have Brad U of Austin, Texas, rolls in his Tesla Model 3 and his 1969 Breitling 2116 reference chronograph. Looking good. We have Marcus of Germany taking us home with his Grand Seiko SPGA 407 of the Skyflake. Guys, watches that were not ready for prime time, and we've got a huge history right here, starting in 1952. But I get ahead of myself. Let's talk about the watch we discussed last time, the Zenith Dayfi Inventor, a watch that is no longer available, is no longer listed on the Zenith website, and in 2019 was hailed as the next great Swiss horological breakthrough, a mechanical watch with the accuracy of a quartz watch. Well, folks who've sent them in for service have found that Zenith won't send them back. Or, if they've sent them in for service, Zenith won't send them back with time-lab documentation of their chronometer status. And those who have the watches and have inquired about chronometer status have not been able to receive that certification from Zenith. So you have a flagship watch that made a huge splash that disappeared unceremoniously and without a trace. Why? Well, it seems that the technology, over 129,000 vibrations per hour, I believe it was 129,600 vibrations per hour, they're having trouble mass producing it tuning it to operate in the 1/3 of a second a day tolerances promised, and apparently it has trouble earning the time-lapse certifications. I would love to know the whole story, so Zenith, if you're out there, reach out to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com and we can set this straight, but it really looks like this watch was disappeared when Zenith struggled to meet the ambitious timing claims with which it was initially launched. But Zenith wouldn't be the first. We go back to 1952 and the Omega Synchrobeat, a 35mm deadbeat seconds watch with a caliber 372. Now the watch was made, it did not perform as expected. There were lubrication issues, there were stopping issues, there were timing issues. And although it seems the early to mid 50s were a golden era for deadbeat seconds watches, Omega decided it wanted no part of this. A mass recall was implemented, and though there are varying accounts of how many watches were made and how many watches were brought back and scrapped, it seems that somewhere between 900 and 1100 were made, and very close to all of them were scrapped, with somewhere between 17 and 50 watches surviving in circulation. Now, they do come up for sale from time to time, and while the Rolex 6556 Truebeat is considered an absolute grail level deadbeat second timepiece, an actual Omega Synchrobeat is probably a less plentiful and more valuable long-term investment due to sheer scarcity. Patek Philippe and the caliber 350. This was the industry's first series production peripheral rotor automatic, shown in 1969, brought to market in 1970. It was problematic from the first. It was a moonshot from the moonshot era in automatic watch winding, making for an automatic watch with the thinness of a manual watch and a winding system that literally no one had been able to make work. And there's a reason for that. Patek made about 10,000 of these all told between 1970 and 1985, struggling to service them, to get them to run as advertised, and ultimately, after 1979, even when they launched the 350 Improuvé, the improved version, it still didn't quite live up to their billing, ultimately being replaced by the center rotor 315 in 1985. It was a failure, and a beautiful failure, and while they can be made to work well today, they require more maintenance and upkeep, and frankly, modern lubricants have been very kind to this movement. It's more viable today than it was back then. Ulysse Nardin and the Freak of 2001. This is a case of a watch just being too ambitious. A double direct impulse escapement, silicon technology as never used in a watch, here deployed in the double direct impulse Breguet-inspired escapement, a carousel tourbillon regulator, and a 7-day power reserve. All of that with a baguette movement that doubles as the minute hand of the watch. The Freak 1 today is the most collectible Freak. You know because you get symmetrical teeth on the escape wheels of silicon. This was an incredible breakthrough, and unfortunately it had a tendency to break, or at least not function as advertised. Many of them were upgraded with Freak 1.5 escape wheels, and while they run better, they are less collectible. Considering what this watch meant to the entire industry in terms of the use of a carousel tourbillon, silicon technology, the double direct impulse escapement, the baguette movement, all of that, the open dial showing you the movement on the dial side, if you find one of these and it's still a Freak 1, seriously consider sending that watch back to Ulysse Nardin unless you get promises in writing from the legal department that they will not swap out the old escape wheels. So while it doesn't work well, just like the original coaxial, if you have that original platinum 1999 Pai-Pan coaxial DeVille, even if it's not working, don't swap out the original parts. Which brings us to the Rolex Yachtmaster 2. Back in 2007, this was the most complicated Rolex watch ever made, and by a mile. 48 jewels, well over 350 movement parts, a flyback and fly-forward programmable memory-equipped regatta timer chronograph. This thing was the works. Unfortunately, it was so complicated that even Rolex needed a second pass. Specifically, there were issues with the flyback/fly-forward feature and the reset. Generally, they were slow. The pusher feel wasn't as crisp as you might expect from Rolex, and all things considered, it needed revisions, which it received in 2013 with the arrival of the caliber 4161. At face value, almost nothing changed, but the function of the movement was a huge improvement over the earlier versions. They're crisp, they're reliable, they work as advertised, but it took mighty Rolex most of a decade to get that right. F. Pigeon and the Sonographe Souverain. I don't mention this because it was the only early F. Pigeon watch that needed second passes from the factory, but because it was the one that generally is considered to have persuaded F. Pigeon to reconsider his development process. Previous to that, he was a little bit of an Elon Musk, an innovator who was willing to use clients as beta test subjects. Well, the Sonographe made a huge splash. Pardon me, that's a resonance right there. That's on me. I'm sorry, Sean, I gave you the wrong picture. But keep in mind, we're talking about the Sonographe here. The Sonographe, launched in 2007, won the GPHG Aiguille d'Or, and that is the grand prize at effectively the Oscars of watchmaking. It's like winning Best Picture. The problem was, even as Journe was receiving the award, there were issues with the watch. The watch was a unique dual drive system with 2 patents that allowed the barrel arbor to drive the chronograph and the barrel teeth to drive the time. All of which is to say, very innovative, and it was spectacular with a 1/100th of a second foudroyant. The problem was, like the Yachtmaster 2, the system didn't always work well. It had problems resetting, it had problems stopping, and it wasn't always capable of actually resolving 1/100th of a second. What happened was that after that, Journe changed his process for developing watches, and far more of the actual development was done in-house, on his own wrist, than on the wrist of clients. And I know when I saw F.P. Journe in 2014, he had his perpetual calendar on his wrist, and at that point, the watch was known in the industry. It had been under development for years. As a result, when that watch came to market, it was absolutely bulletproof, and that's basically how F.P. Journe launches have been ever since. The watches now are as rare as Journe's have ever been, but they're as reliable out of the gate as a Rolex. Now, this one is famous, the Harry Winston Opus 3, a watch that was launched as the third of the Opus collaborations between Harry Winston, Max Bucer, and in this case, Vianney Halter. Now, there were at least 3 different watchmakers who spent the better part of a decade trying to make this thing work. Jumping hours, jumping minutes, jumping date, it even had jumping seconds for the last 4 seconds of the hour. It was the one that made the Opus series. The first 2, by F.P. Journe and Thomas Prescher, were well received, but with polite applause. This spectacular thing, a world premiere in its function, was what convinced people that the Harry Winston Opus series would be the event of the year at Baselworld and a perpetual font of grail watches by the great masters in the business. The problem is, it wasn't until Audemars Piguet, Renaud et Papy got their hands on this thing that they were able to make it work and deliver it to clients in 2012, again, almost a decade after the Vianney Halter conceived original was first shown to great acclaim. This is an example of a watch that almost didn't make it to market because it was so damn complicated to get it to work as intended, showing the difference between what a prototype can achieve on the stand at Baselworld and the standard of durability you need on a client's wrist in the real world. Let's see what's going on right here. We have Jabo Surf saying, I'm out, see you kids. Jabo, thanks for joining in. I know it's early where you are, you got to go to work. We've got Zephyr B asking, Tim, what's your opinion about the Patek 5205 G13? That is the one to buy. If you're going to get a 5205, the vignette blue dial is the most attractive. That is an annual calendar. It is a lovely thing. It's nicely sized. I want to say that model came out in 2018, so it's probably the most refined look. And while yes, blue dials and gradient dials are very much of our moment, I think that is one that's going to stand the test of time. It is my favorite version of that watch, and one of the Pateks I would most like to own. So I am a big fan of that. Christopher H, Tim, back to the Netflix thing. How about doing a mini series rather than a running series? That way it won't take you away from us for very long. You know, TV is a lot of work. Like, I'm ready to write it, I'm ready to produce it, but I know what lies beyond that Maginot line of Netflix money. Once passed, things get real. So, could I do a Netflix series? Yes. Would it take me away from YouTube? You better believe it. I would love to do it. It would be the height of my career until watchmaking happens, which, by the way, is in progress. But I'm very cautious about it because I would have to let the YouTube watch community go. That said, Netflix, if you're listening, give me a call. What else is going on right here? We got Samir F saying, I connect with reissues like the Zenith Chronomaster Original, Omega Trilogy, Seiko SLA 17, Would you say too many mid-tier reissues is the wrong way to go? I think those will always be nice watches. Now, do you mean as a collector or for the industry as a whole? I think the industry is just about running its course with the mass reissues. It's been a thing for a decade. I don't know who started it, whether it was the Omega Museum series in 2001 or Les Historiques at Vacheron in the early 90s before that. But I would say really the watch that probably prompted the current era of like vintage reissues, line for line, detail for detail, was the 2007 Longines Legend Diver. And I think that's when we were off to the races and everyone had to get into it for better or worse. Now, as a collector, I think it's good to have a few of these watches. I wouldn't make it the whole collection, but I think because these watches are crowd pleasers and they were never intended to be very challenging in design or concept, you should always be able to sell them. Because there's always someone who wants that vintage look with modern box papers, condition, and water resistance, as well as reliability. Okay. We have Jaquet asking, Tim, thoughts on the Cyber Skull from Bell & Ross? I never liked the Memento Mori watches from Bell & Ross. To me, it's not the side of Bell & Ross that I love. I understand that they're Parisian-based, they're a design house, they're not necessarily an instrument watch company, but it is the instrument watch that first drew my attention to them, and I think something like the 42mm BR03 is just about perfect. I'd probably be looking at a ceramic version of that, maybe in khaki green. I liked that model, rather than the Cyber Skulls, or any of the skulls for that matter. To me, that's just not the Bell & Ross that I like, and it's probably not the Bell & Ross that collectors like, because I know those watches tend to be very slow secondary market sellers. What else is going on? Kevin saying, Tim, is a slowdown in demand ever going to happen where watches can be bought retail? It seems like one brand's hot watch becomes unavailable and the pack moves to the next brand. It does seem like that, doesn't it? Demand at Rolex creates demand at Zenith. Demand at Patek creates demand at Bulgari. I just want to remind you guys that there are literally thousands of watch models and probably hundreds of brands historically that no one's paying attention to. The best watches in the world, made by the likes of Parmigiani, Glasuta Original, Ulysse Nardin, Gerard Perregaux, they are ripe for the taking because no one is buying them right now. Some of these include incredible aesthetic and technological revolutions, not evolutions. The Freak 1, you can buy that watch for like 60 grand in great condition, full box and papers. That won't even get you 3/4 of the way to a steel 5711. And I should mention that there are watches out there like the Glasuta Original Senator Cosmopolite, probably the world's single most sophisticated travel watch. And again, no one is bidding this thing up. You can buy it used at a huge knockoff its original retail price. And even in the world of Bulgari, yes, there's demand, but there are a lot of watches out there, even from the Octo Finissimo family, that can be bought at or below retail because they have not yet attained to the stature of AP and Patek, or even Vacheron for that matter. And speaking of Vacheron, the Vacheron complications are the best buy in the high horology industry. I'm talking about Malt chronographs as beautifully made as any Patek Philippe 5070. I'm talking about watches like the 47112, the perpetual calendar chronograph, La Magna powered, beautifully sized at under 40 millimeters. It's the watch Colin Farrell wore in the Miami Vice remake because Michael Mann's a Vacheron fan. It's a very cool watch, and again, you should be able to get your hands on that in gold for under $50,000 with a Hunter display case back. And we're talking a perpetual calendar chronograph from Vacheron. There are a lot of watches like that out there, and you've got to look at those watches and realize no one wants those watches right now. You can definitely get on board with realistic money. $10,000 buys you a Blancpain 50 Fathoms. Why spend multiples of that on some sort of Patek Philippe or Vacheron that's going to give you no more pleasure, that has no more pedigree or history, let's be honest, than the 50 Fathoms in its history back to 1953. And $10,000 will not get you anywhere near a Rolex Hulk right now. But again, what is the true historical peer to the Rolex Submariner? It's the 50 Fathoms, and you can get them easily right now, including in the reference 5008, which is the 40.3 millimeter version that wears like a Rolex on the wrist. What else is going on in the box right here? We have Nefarion saying, anyone who read Car and Driver as a kid saw Bell & Ross in the back pages. That's a fact. And then we've got Simon Holt saying, just got my Zing U1B, love the blue dial. I love that one too. And then we have Mark S saying, Tim, I feel like I saw Michael Mann with a white Daytona while filming Collateral. Have you ever checked out behind the scenes? I would love confirmation. I think that is true. I would have to double check though, but I think I've heard that same story. And right here, we've got Watch Gnosis asking, it seems Tudor Heritage Advisor might be discontinued. Will Tudor make another alarm watch? If not, what other alarm watch should we look at below 10K? Master Compressor Memovox from JLC. Look for that below 10K. You could probably find many different modern Vulcain cricket models, including the nautical for under 10K. I would also say, realistically, there have been a lot of Oris alarms. Eterna has made alarms. Fortis has made alarm chronographs, which, if you've got the wrist for them, a rare case of high horology independence in mass-produced watches. Paul Gerber designed the original 1998 Fortis chronograph alarm. That's definitely one to look at. Guys, thank you so much for joining in. This has been a big show and a big delivery. I want to thank Sean for working through the hiccups that I built into the show, and thank for all of you guys for hanging in with me. Until the next time, time out, Tim out, and thanks for logging on.